So can you remember arguing with your mates at school in the playground until you were blue in the face about how much better your computer or console was than his? The console wars. Oh yeah, the console wars. It got me thinking. I wonder if kids today still argue in the playground with their mates that their console is better than their mates. I.e., you know, my Switch is better than your PS5, or my PS5 is better than your Xbox. I wonder if they do. There does seem to be some debate. I've asked my nephew, who's like a senior school teenager, and it seems quite uncool to like Nintendo. This sort of thinking there seems to be that the PlayStation and Xbox are better. But it really got me thinking when I started thinking about the so-called console wars, how nowadays it seems largely irrelevant to me, because games, pretty much, if you disregard all of the sort of console exclusives that you can only play on whatever console, the consoles themselves largely all look the same. So if you were looking at a cross-platform game, it doesn't really matter which of the three consoles it's on, because they all pretty much look and sound exactly the same. Yes, there are technical differences, and some things might run better on one thing than another, but broadly speaking, the console itself will play the game and it will look and sound pretty much exactly the same. And that got me thinking how the console wars are pretty much irrelevant. But that wasn't the case back in the day, because consoles had a personality, and there really was a difference in the consoles back in our day when we were at school. So I really think there was something in it then when we used to argue with our mates till we were blue in the face. So it all started on the mighty ZX Spectrum for me, and I would have argued with anybody that said the Spectrum wasn't the best computer you could buy in the early 1980s. And to a large extent I would still say that now, because it's just iconic, and to me it's really special place in my heart, because it's where my passion with gaming started. But going back to the old school playground, at the time you either had a Spectrum or you had a Commodore 64. I personally didn't know anyone with an Atari or games console of any description. So although they were around earlier, I never had those or experienced them. For me it started on the home computer, and like I say, you either had, at least in my school, a Spectrum or a Commodore. And they were the only two formats I was really aware of until the consoles came around a few years later. And I'd say there was a fairly even split in my school between Spectrum and Commodore, but all of us Spectrum lads, we obviously thought the Spectrum was best, and all the Commodore lads thought the Commodore was best, and never the twain shall meet at the time. But they were so unique and totally different machines, really. You had the beautiful, colourful graphics on the Spectrum, which were predominantly all monochrome graphics, but they were in much finer detail than they were on the Commodore 64, and to me looked a lot better, because although they were sort of monochrome, they looked much more realistic and lifelike because of the more exquisite detail you got from a Spectrum game than you got from a Commodore game. And then the sound obviously was totally different on both formats. initially on the 48k Spectrum, there wasn't much sound at all, was there? But when I upgraded to the 128, that was a whole different ball game. The sound chip in that was fantastic, and much like we've got here on Renegade, we've got some beautiful tunes on the Mighty Spectrum. But obviously you can't really argue with the Commodore 64 that has got an amazing sound chip in that, and some of the music on the Commodore games is absolutely magnificent. So now we've got the Commodore version of Renegade running, and quite a dramatic difference to the Spectrum. We've got sort of much more blocky, less detailed characters, with obviously some much nicer colour and more distinguishable colours in the characters and the backgrounds than we have in the Spectrum. We've got quite a nice jolly tune, but for me that was the 128 version of the Spectrum music, and I find that personally better. But there are much stronger musical tracks on some other Commodore games. This is not particularly a great one, I would say, but I just wanted to put Renegade on as a direct comparison to the Spectrum version, so you can see a clear difference in the graphics if you're not aware of it. But that was such unique times. You knew what game, or you knew what system each game was running on. When you saw it in a magazine, or you might see it on a TV somewhere, you knew it was Spectrum or you knew it was Commodore. And when we sort of devoured the back of the boxes in the shops, dreaming of the games we would love to buy if we had the money, you knew what screenshots are featured on the back of the boxes, because you know, crazy days, no internet, you bought a game on the artwork on the front and the screenshots on the back, and very often they wouldn't put the screenshots of the actual version of the game you were looking at. They would put arguably better screenshots from some other version of the game and put something on the back of the box to the like of screenshots may vary. And so it was blatant misadvertising. You know, they might put the Amiga version, for instance, on the Spectrum or the Commodore box to lead you into full sense of security that that's what you were going to get. But we knew, didn't we? Because you could tell what was Spectrum graphics and you could tell what were Commodore 64 graphics. Both fantastic machines in their own way, and whichever one you had at the time, you would have championed it to the hilt and said it was the greatest computer ever made, and it probably was to you or me at that time. The ironic thing is, between the Commodore and the Spectrum, which were the dominant computers obviously in the UK, the sort of poor relation, if you like, was the Amstrad CPC. I knew nobody with one, and I don't think anybody bought one or had one except Alan Sugar and Craig. But I'm sure there must have been other people who had one. I just didn't know any. But the ironic thing is that any game that was programmed properly and taken advantage of the Amstrad's capabilities, there's a strong argument to suggest that the Amstrad is actually the best computer of the three, because some games on it, which are specific Amstrad games rather than poor man's Spectrum ports, they are stunning. They've got the best of both worlds. They've got amazing colour, amazing detailed sprites and characters, and they look sensational. There just aren't many of them. So all the arguing that went on in the playground in the day between us Spectrum and other Commodore owners, little did we know that the tiny percentage of people who had the Amstrad, in some cases, had the best computer of all, but just not very often. But then this argument of the console wars then moves on to the next generation, and for me there are striking similarities between the Spectrum and Commodore war and then the Master System and NES. Following on from the Spectrum versus Commodore, you know, as time moved on, we all moved on to consoles, didn't we? Or most of us did. And I think there's some correlation between the Master System and the NES to the Spectrum and the Commodore, because I think there are some very similar characteristics. How the Master System was supremely colourful, just like the Spectrum was, and the NES was a much more muted palette, much like the Commodore 64 was. So I kind of think there's a bit of a similarity there, and it's kind of not lost on me that I went from the Spectrum to the Master System, because, like I say, it feels like a natural progression, because it's got the same sort of bright and beautiful bold colours that the Spectrum had, only obviously you get much more detail and you know, broadly a more arcade-like experience with the Master System compared with the Spectrum, because obviously things have moved on. And at the time it felt like you got more or less got yourself an arcade machine when you got yourself a Master System, especially having moved on from the Spectrum, which was obviously quite primitive compared with the Master System. And the NES really never got a look in for me at the time, purely because, I don't know, the Master System seemed so much better, and I knew nobody with an NES. But it's funny how things work out, because in more later years I've got much more into the NES or Famicom, and that's kind of changed my opinion of these two, really. So in much later years I particularly got into the NES and the Famicom, purely because it passed me by back in the day. But nowadays I've discovered what actually a fantastic console it is. But getting back to the console wars, there's a distinct difference between the NES and the Master System. Like I was saying, the Master System is much more colourful and bright, and much like the Spectrum, and the NES has got a much more muted and more simplistic colour palette, much like the C64. And on the face of it, you think, well, the Master System's clearly the better console, which is what I thought at the time and would have defended it to the hilt. But with hindsight, the Master System is still fantastic, don't get me wrong. But there's a lot to be said for the NES and the Famicom in particular, because the library on the Famicom is magnificent, and it's far superior to the Master System, without any question. So, had I got to choose now, I would definitely choose a Famicom, because although the games don't look quite as good, as you can see from Paperboy here, if you compare it to the previous section where the Paperboy version was running on the Master System, there's a clear difference. But like I say, the game library on the NES is vastly superior. So both fantastic consoles, but for differing reasons, which again is much like the Spectrum and the Commodore. So I do find it quite interesting how the two generations are very similar in certain ways. How the sort of style of the consoles carried on into this generation. And again, much like the previous one I've just talked about, there's no clear winner, obviously. That you need both. You know, at the time when we were at school, you had one or the other, didn't you? You couldn't afford both. You had what your parents bought you for Christmas or your birthday, and so that was all you knew, and that was what you thought was best. Nowadays, we're in a position where we can probably own both and play both, and that's the way to go. But in terms of the console wars, I was staunch Master System. I didn't actually know anybody who had a Nintendo So I didn't have really anybody to argue with at the time. But had I have had someone, I would have said the Master System was way better. I've changed my opinion now. They're both fantastic consoles, but if I could only have one, I would definitely have a Nintendo. Now again, these, because just like the Spectrum and Commodore and the Master System and the Nintendo, very unique personalities, it really mattered which consoles you owned. And I think you can say the same again for the next generation, the Super Nintendo and the Mega Drive. So I find it fascinating. Much like the previous two generations, the Mega Drive and Super Nintendo, the games for each system, you could instantly tell what they were on just by looking at the graphics and hearing the music and sound effects. They were absolutely unique, and if, you know, the game was just running on a TV, you'd know it was for Mega Drive or Super Nintendo purely by how it looked and how it sounded. And I think that's something that's been lost, that doesn't exist on modern platforms. And it's purely unique to this generation and the previous ones, and it's slowly eradicated over time. So obviously we've got Aladdin on the Mega Drive running here, but you could throw this at any sort of cross-platform game or any game in general. You know, you could see something and you'd know that's a Mega Drive game. And it's such a wonderful time. There's no clear winner for me between the Super Nintendo and the Mega Drive. They are both fantastic consoles. And you could argue that this is the greatest generation that there's ever been, because the games were fantastic at the time. They felt like arcade games, really, compared with what we'd played before. But they've aged amazingly well, and they still look and play fantastically to this day in the most part. And they're obviously still making games that look like 16-bit games because of how good they are. So this was truly a golden age for me, and you know, what a time it was to be alive. We were so lucky. It's just amazing that we were around to experience this. We've now got Aladdin running on the Super Nintendo, which, although is another amazing game, it looks and sounds totally different to the Mega Drive version. But you knew exactly as soon as you saw them, didn't you, if it was SNES or Mega Drive. And even to this day, you hear some SNES music or sound effects or tunes, and you know instantly it's running on a Super Nintendo, don't you? It's got such a unique sound to it. Absolutely magnificent. It's never been sort of recreated on anything else. You know instantly it's Super Nintendo music, and it's such an amazing quality it's got, as the Mega Drive has in its own right. But it's just fascinating how these consoles have like a personality which has been lost as time has gone on in more current generations. And I think you could argue this point again in the next generation with the Saturn and the PlayStation, though I do feel it's much less evident than it was in these three generations I've talked about. You know, I think it's becoming more about the games and the libraries of games on each console. You can argue that the Saturn is much better for 2D games, and broadly speaking you could say the PS1 is much better for 3D games, but that's just a generalisation. I think if you saw just stills of games on both systems, 2D and 3D, they both kind of look similar. So although you can make the argument to a lesser extent, I don't think it's anywhere near as evident as it has been in these generations I've been talking about. and subsequently in later generations it's completely disappeared totally, and it's purely about the game libraries on each console as far as I'm concerned. If you want to play Nintendo games, you've got to buy a Nintendo console, for example, or you might be someone who likes the ultimate technical performance that you only get through buying like the latest PlayStation or Xbox, each to their own. But as I was saying, it's purely down to the games now, and the consoles themselves really, for me, haven't got a personality like they used to have in the good old days. And I'm not trying to say I'm not trying to sound old and miserable. You know, modern gaming is fantastic in many ways, brilliant. You know, I'm loving the PS5 and the Switch 2, both amazing consoles. But what I'm talking about is the fact that the personality in the actual console has gone, and that kind of uniqueness was evident in the 80s and into the 90s, but has subsequently died away. Though, like I said right at the start, I am sure kids of today still rant and rave about whatever console they've got and argue that their mates, whatever different console they've got, is utter crap and theirs is the best. It must still go on, I'm sure it does. But, and you're always going to sort of champion the stuff you had when you were a kid, aren't you? You know, a modern day child today is going to think these times are the best in another 20, 30 years, just like we think the 80s and the 90s were the best now. It's life, you know, that's what happens. But for me, I think we were alive, if you're my kind of age, we were alive at the greatest time possible to experience the world of gaming. There was no time like the 80s and 90s. It'll never be surpassed to me. But there's a lot to be said for modern gaming, like I say. But for me, the 80s and 90s, magnificent. They were the days, eh, guys and girls?